Excuse me, who are you?
Perfect Blue is a psychological thriller presented in the style of a Japanese animated film, or as we in the business like to call it, anime. Viewers are pulled into the narrative as different psychiatric disorders such as dissociative identity disorder or DID, post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, and psychosis are explored. The film's stylistic choices in its pacing, its narrative structure, and its unexpected transitions all work together to induce a sort of dissociative state among the viewer. As the story continues to unfold, the film continues to subvert the viewer's expectations, leading them to question their own discernment between what is real and what is only a figment of the imagination. As we move forward in this video, we will explore some of the key psychodynamic ego defenses employed in the film's narrative, such as projection and introjection. Following this, we will examine the realism of several of the psychiatric disorders that are depicted by the movie. Finally, we will conclude this video with a discussion that compares the way that the film has depicted these psychiatric disorders with how they are generally understood in real life. The ego's defensive operations were initially described by Freud before being elaborated by his daughter, Anna Freud, in her 1936 book, The Ego and Mechanisms of Defense. As she describes, the ego must employ certain defenses to mitigate the disjunction between the pleasure-seeking drives of the id as they arise into the purview of the ego and are shunned as inappropriate by the superego. Many such ego defenses have been described, but for the purpose of this video, we will focus on the topic of projection and introjection. As described by Nancy McWilliams in her book Psychoanalytic Diagnosis, projection can be thought of as the mistaken belief that internal feelings are actually coming from some external source. Now, in contrast to that, introjection is the mistaken belief that some external perspective or emotion is actually coming from within the self. Within Perfect Blue, Mima is the subject to the projection of her fans, most prominently her manager Rumi. Pausing to extrapolate from this animated example to consider the real world, we can consider a range of people varying from pop stars to college students with online personas. Such practices of curating a glorified perception of the self online opens up oneself to the projections of their viewers. Followers of these content creators often project their idealized or even demoralized views onto those whom they consume online. Over the course of navigating this projection from the masses, one may find that they start to identify with what has been projected upon them. This leads to a blurring of the lines between one's authentic identity and the identity that has been imposed upon them. And it's this integration of the projection from others that can be described as introjection. Introjection in its most distilled form is the mistaken perception that what is derived from an external object or person in terms of a perspective or an emotion is actually coming from within the self. Mima struggles with this to an increasing degree as she spends her nights reading Mima's Room, the online blog that depicts her life, thoughts, and desires from a first-person perspective. Despite the fact that Mima herself did not write these things, she struggles with introjection as the delineation between her actual thoughts and feelings and what she reads online breaks down. She is particularly susceptible to this in part due to her amorphous view of self. Her lack of stable identity will be explored further as we continue to discuss her borderline level characterization of personality. Before moving on, I would like to stretch this idea just a bit further to consider some of the effects that projective identification may have in our current time. As we talked about earlier, most of these online personas only showcase what they want others to see. This typically manifests as a sort of highlight reel of their lives. They showcase only their best moments and their most polished takes on current events. And as this trend continues, some may start to identify more and more to an increasing degree with the persona that they have curated of themselves online. This over-identification with what has been projected can be thought of as a projective identification. And over time, this very concept of projective identification may lead to a growing sense of inadequacy as The subconscious continues to monitor the discrepancies between this idealized self that is projected online and the authentic self that exists in reality. Here's a statistic. Jonathan Haidt, in his 2024 book, notes that we have seen a 167% increase in female adolescent suicides and a 188% increase in female adolescent self-harm leading to emergency room visits.
Yes, I'd like to be recognized as an actress.
Most prevalent among the psychiatric disorders presented within the film, we find a dramatized depiction of dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as multiple personality disorder, before being updated in the 1994 release of the DSM-4. This disorder was further popularized among the public in large part due to the 1976 film Sybil. According to the current version of the DSM-5 TR, this disorder is characterized by two or more distinct personality states in conjunction with regular lapses in the recall of daily events. The symptoms must cause significant distress while not being the result of some cultural norm or exogenous substance. As the narrative progresses, we are intentionally led to believe that Mima is the featured character that exhibits this disorder within the film. We'll talk more about Mima later. But in the meantime, as the major twist of the film is presented to us, we come to understand that it is actually Rumi who showcases the disorder of DID within the movie. To our surprise, Rumi has one distinct personality state in which she is Mima's manager, and another distinct state in which she believes that she is Mima herself. Rumi stays up at night writing for the aforementioned online blog, Mima's Room, from the first-person perspective of Mima. In the final scenes of the film, we finally get the closure that Rumi has been admitted to a psychiatric hospital and is officially diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder. As for Mima herself, I believe it is important to look back at the source of her decompensation as depicted by the film. She is coerced into filming a sexual assault scene on the new TV show Double Bind within the role that her agent landed for her. Mima is internally aware that to film such a scene is beyond her moral purview, but her lack of personal boundaries prevails as she convinces herself that she should undermine her own personal needs for the perceived good of others.
I absolutely refuse to do it!
Mima finds herself in a lose-lose situation with competing signals as to what she should do next. This, ironically, is truly the original meaning behind the psychological term double bind. After filming the disturbing scene, we see her begin to spiral. During filming, she stares up at the stage lights, and we are led to believe that this is the first true state of dissociation depicted from her perspective within the film. This point is driven home when the viewer is led to question how long she has remained dissociated, as we are shown that her fish have died in their tank when she finally returns to lucidity. This is a detail that is often easily overlooked by first-time viewers of the movie. While Mima does show signs of a more borderline characterological organization, as made evident by her impulsivity, lack of boundaries, and poor sense of self, we simply don't have the luxury of understanding more about her past experiences within such a short and pointed film. Therefore, I'm not so quick to label her with borderline personality disorder, or even dissociative identity disorder for that matter, without first considering that what we may be seeing within the movie is her exhibiting signs and symptoms of PTSD while relying on more borderline or primitive, as it's called in the literature, modes of defense. Starting with the trauma of filming the sexual assault scene, in which Mima first experiences dissociation and a total loss of control, we begin to bolster the theory that she suffers from PTSD within the film's narrative. Beyond the point of this initial trauma, various figures in her life, whom she has worked closely with, are murdered. She is repeatedly exposed to this violence, and without any support or respite from her work, we are led to believe that she suffers increasingly as she unconsciously employs dissociation as a primary mode of defense. As the violent acts taking place around her are repeatedly described to her, she is plagued with dissociative flashbacks and seems to begin confusing her dreams with memories from her waking life. We may also suggest that in an attempt to reclaim her trauma of being sexually assaulted, she agrees to move forward with a nude photo shoot. This may be an effort to regain some sort of semblance of control over a similar situation, as described in Van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score. In the end, this only exacerbates the dynamics surrounding Mima as she continues to decompensate further, questioning of herself, who are you? So, where do we land in our overall evaluation of Mima? At this juncture, Mima is depicted as a young female who is suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder with dissociative symptoms of depersonalization and derealization. We are left with the following diagnostic criteria of the disorder accounted for. Mima herself has indeed experienced firsthand a traumatic experience. Additionally, those close to her have continuously been murdered throughout the movie, and she has been repeatedly exposed to the details of those traumatic events. She has recurrent, distressing nightmares related to those events, and she continues to have these dissociative flashbacks. She even has trouble remembering accurate details of the event. And as the film goes on, she is essentially depicted as becoming more and more estranged from her peers. She begins isolating herself and engaging in this perpetual self-blame, and is shown experiencing continuous negative emotion. She even becomes more and more anhedonic as the film progresses. In fairness, we seem to miss the criterion that she is actively trying to avoid reminders of her traumatic experiences within the film. But the relatively short runtime of the movie allows us to imagine that this detail is perhaps to be inferred. As dramatizations of real-world disorders, films tend to rely on particular tropes to convey the severity of different characters' suffering. And considering that movies are primarily a visual medium, one of the tropes that they tend to rely on more heavily than they should, in the interest of being technically sound, would be visual hallucinations. And we see these visual hallucinations depicted continuously throughout the film. They even happen more and more frequently as the narrative progresses. While we've discussed the ways that the film quite accurately depicts both PTSD and DID, we need to take a moment to note that such vivid and distinct visual and auditory hallucinations would be unlikely in these disorders without a comorbid diagnosis of acute psychosis. At this point, you can decide for yourself if these depictions of hallucinations are more of a stylistic choice meant to showcase the characters' internal fears and monologues, or if they are meant to show you what is literally happening within the story. Regardless, this cinematic trope is often utilized in psychological thrillers, and movies continue to lean a bit too heavily into visual hallucinations while having the main goal of depicting some other psychiatric disorder. One of the key defense mechanisms that can be described as a more primitive defense mechanism that we see Mima employ throughout the film would be dissociation. And this is one of the driving factors that adds to the confusion and our overall approach to trying to identify what exactly she is suffering from and what exactly is going on within the narrative. Perfect Blue makes an ambitious attempt to describe and portray more nuanced psychiatric disorders and psychodynamic defense mechanisms through a unique mode of visual storytelling. Despite the film's more technical shortcomings and limitations, I remain impressed with the accuracy and narrative development that it achieves over such a relatively short runtime of around 77 minutes. I genuinely found myself pulled into the film, particularly during my first viewing, as my expectations of what constituted reality within the narrative were continually subverted. Further, I found the questions that the film posits regarding the role of projection and introjection among public figures in the modern age to be increasingly relevant over time. And in the end, Perfect Blue may lead us all for just a moment to pause in the mirror and ask, who are you?